once again, I want to thank you for your participation. Good evening, dear colleagues. I love being here among so many open minds and open spirits. Entonces, con el decremento en la materia y la energía que usan las economías,
in order to survive, we also need to do a cultural transformation that will produce livelihoods, relationships, politics, not driven by growth. Many of you here are working on different fronts towards those transformations. And now I'm going to talk about one line of action, altering the systems through which socialized humans and their worlds are produced, sustained, and adapted. Homo sapiens did not survive as individual organisms. Competitive individualism, selfish gene, desire to accumulate private property are not hardwired by evolution into our biology. What is part of, yes, está bien. What is key to our survival is a capacity for symbolic thought and communication that allows groups of Homo sapiens to develop languages, kinship, ideologies, economies that survive the individual organism and that produce new generations of humans, their habits, and their habitats. These social cultural systems are our most fundamental commons. In all of their diversity, they've allowed groups of humans to survive and to adapt over millennia and have led other groups to collapse. Today I'm going to talk about two of these systems that are common in every human group known: gender and ethnicity. I'll just let you read the definitions I'm working with now. So, ethnic and gender systems create varying forms of knowing and being. They prevent this kind of situation where all humans see and act on the world in the same way, putting all their eggs in the same basket. So just like biodiversity adds resilience to ecosystems, cultural diversity also makes human livelihoods resilient in times of change. Next, okay. I'm sorry, I don't have a remote control. I'm trying to get the next slides. Okay. So, okay. Sorry about this, we'll get it worked out. Okay, so for 20 years, I lived with and worked with, on and off, farmers in the Andes, looking at how their ethnic and gender systems work to produce and interconnect an amazing array of different technologies, knowledges, species, spaces, germplasm, eco-niches at different altitudes, types of exchange, reciprocity, markets. The most interesting thing for us today is the historical and archaeological record that shows that those systems have adapted over centuries to allow people to survive in quite fragile environments, also in the face of Inca expansion, colonial expansion, not to mention Western development. So, okay, gender and ethnic systems aren't by definition sustainable or unsustainable, equitable or unequitable. That's a historical question that needs to be asked looking at every instance in context. Today we're interested in those manifestations unique to the Capitalocene, an era that dawned about 500 years ago with the interconnected expansion of European colonialism, capitalism, and Western science. In that process, ethnicity and gender were harnessed to shape certain types of unequal exchanges that were absolutely vital in the production and the expansion of economies and environmental impact that came to characterize that era. One of the features typical of that, or one of the features I want to look at, is appropriation through racialization. Even though humans in all kinds of contexts develop ethnicity, Race is a specific manifestation. It's different from other forms of ethnicity in important ways. First, it's historically specific. It only happened in the capitalist And second, the ideology is about Western science. It's about biological explanation of blood, DNA, etc., as a reason to say what's different. In the Americas, during this last few hundred years, Europeans and their descendants manipulated various forms of ethnicity and ethno-racialization to appropriate bodies, land, and other resources from indigenous and African people. One of the justifications they used was that Europeans are innately better at managing resources. No doubt they're superior at changing select resources into cash that contribute to GDP growth. Only with global ecological crises are we realizing that some of those devalued ethnic management techniques called derelict, lazy, unproductive might be superior in terms of sustaining and regenerating resources over time and space. Another feature of this Capitalocene I want to talk about is the hierarchical gendering of productive and reproductive realms. For 99% of history, humans have not worked in order to get cash or accumulate wealth. Masculinities, femininities, other social identities were built around labor oriented towards sustaining and reproducing families, communities, and environment. In the Industrial Revolution, it was not easy to convince people to sell their labor for money. It took really brutal efforts, enclosures of the commons, chaining people to the looms. In Latin America, it was the same thing. The historical record shows brutal efforts to force people or lure people into working in the mines, the farms, etc. Once people did figure out how to get men, women, and children doing labor for someone else's profit, they ran into a problem of reproduction. A lot of sickness, incapacities, early death. Moreover, many of these people found it either they were incapable or unwilling to work to serve the demands of productive labor and also invest in the tremendous labor necessary to reproduce themselves by raising children to be future workers. That was enormous, that was overwhelming. So these two problems were solved by a brilliant new mode of production that you all know very well. It's a historic mode that manipulated gender to assure the supply and to sustain labor. It's a tripartite model. First, divorce production from reproduction. Secondly, identify production as masculine, reproduction as feminine, and then reward production with more money, power, and prestige. This system worked very well to convince, well, it has worked to convince some men to sell their labor even at exploitative and degrading conditions in order to access that money and power that was connected to that role, right? By the 20th century, this mode had been generalized around the world to the extent that people began to believe that from the Paleolithic picapiedras into the supersonic future, this is the way humans organize production and reproduction. One of the most important critiques of this mode of production has come from feminists. In the last 30 or 40 years have been pointing out the problems in the barriers that women face in meeting the different capitals, the money, the power, the education, connected with the productive realm. Unfortunately, that critique has been responded by international organizations, governments, largely by moving women into the masculine productive realm. As you can see, in Latin America alone, in 30 years, the World Bank counts that 70 million women are added into the workforce. What is the implication of this dangerous liaison between feminist motivations and growth, pro-growth pushes, right? You can see a few of the complications that come out. Moving women into paid work without supporting changes in masculinities and without supporting public support for reproduction has led to really contradictory outcomes. Certainly, women's underpaid labor has fueled economic growth and supercharged societal metabolism. At the same time, some women have gained access to more power and money by moving into the productive realm. But the search for healthier, more equitable gender systems is really mixed. The outcomes are really complex. I wouldn't say it's good or bad. And we're finding families, communities, environments facing new challenges. So, degrowth responses must address gender inequality in deeply different ways. Some of the options are increasing valuation and investment in reproductive realms. Also would be figuring out how to support and create masculinities correlated with care for and sustenance of families, of communities, of environments. Unfortunately, many contemporary men reject this. It's an affront to these proposals are emasculating for the individual and weakening the nation state to have men move into the reproductive realm, right? So one of the things I've been exploring in conversations is to open conversations for gender change by making more visible the prices that men pay to be part of that productive mode. So around the world, men suffer far, far higher rates of homicide, suicide, incarceration, occupational accidents, car accidents, military, sport, gang violence than do women, and their life expectancies are much lower, right? This is information from the World Health Organization that said in the Americas, for every one woman who's murdered, 10 men are murdered. Highly gendered violence against men. They also use intersectional analysis to say that category of men isn't homogeneous. In this case, the lower educated men bear a much higher brunt of that violence. But you people here that embody dominant masculinities don't get away scot-free either. There's other costs that are paid by being in different masculine positionalities that we can talk about later. All right, go ahead. So, these charts show that starting in the mid-20th century, life expectancies in the world and in Latin America created a gap so that every year women outlived men by more time than the year before. This happens to correspond with the period we call the Great Acceleration, a period in which economic growth was just Viagra-fueled straight up. Also, petroleum use, emissions, garbage, resource use went very quickly upward. What we know is that in Latin America, this period was fueled largely by one of the motors of this expansion was extractivism, what Maristela Svampa talked about this morning. Mining, drilling, agro-industry that damages local environments, contributes to global ecological problems. We know that these ventures are profitable only because in conditions of unequal exchange of ecological value and economic value. They also require access to a certain kind of human resource. Tough, risk-taking, disposable beasts of burden. Millions of men are now working in risky, dangerous jobs with very high fatality levels, suffering day by day as ways to fulfill expectations of masculinity that have built into this social cultural mode. Go on. So in sum, when we're thinking together about degrowth, ethnicity, and gender, it moves us to think at a deeper level of forging radically different modes of reproducing that are gentler and more nurturing for men and women and the environment. It's a great moment to do this because there's been tremendous innovation, debate, jostling in all across the world of ethno, race, and gender identities. It hasn't been connected very much with the degrowth publications and conversations, but there's tremendous synergy to be had with the formation of new political subjectivities around these identities. And what we can see is ethno-racial solidarity and discourse have been motivated by claims for territorial control, for ethnic governance of bodies, lands, resources, territories that are using languages, mythologies, usos y costumbres, unique and different across different ways. At the same time, we can see that there's an explosion of gender and sexual differences. One of the things that's happening is that forms of being that were repressed in recent modern history are resurging and being resuscitated in new ways. We can also see an innovation and expression of different types of gender and sexual expressions. Different ideas about the family, about the identity. And I'll just finish with this example. People whose experimentation, they say, revolution while we're laughing, right? We can't do the revolution without sin gozar. And so those kind of movements in gender and ethnicity, of olla común, of marchas, demandas across that, those are really powerful moments that allow us to connect with degrowth and think about transforming these systems to make them more nurturing and well-being for everybody. All right, I'm just going to end by mentioning research that I'm doing now with working men in different parts of Latin America who are talking about the challenges that they've lived, the hurts that they've undergone in struggling to meet expectations of manliness. And they're also bringing up experience of how they're trying to accept and internalize for themselves practices of care, of regeneration for their own bodies, their own spirits, and those around them, and maybe set a model for their sons who will be able to explore a wider horizon of masculinities. All right, so in conclusion, Capitalocene systems create challenge for global survival. One of them is that the dominance of one mode of being and knowing reduces diversity. That puts us in a very dangerous situation. The other is that the scientific portrayal of this dominant mode as biologically determined paralyzes us and narrows our horizon for innovation. Some things that we can do: learn from and with diverse approaches to ethnic-based government oriented towards sustaining cultural and natural resources rather than growth and accumulation. Increase value and reward for labor that cares for and sustains and regenerates life. Seek and dignify gentler paths to human being for diverse masculinities, for colonizers, for powerful people and weak people. Practice amongst ourselves identities and relationships less subordinate to growth and more directed to well-being and happiness. Last slide. So these moves are part of a bigger project to forge healthy and happy paths for a wider range of being. And that includes celebrating humans' unique ability to imagine, communicate, and construct an endless variety of socio-ecological worlds. Our possibilities are so much larger than our current debates allow for. We can also learn from and defend lifeways that are critiqued as inimical to economic growth. Anything from Amazonian tribes to eco-communes in Barcelona. There's our places to learn. Finally, treat diverse languages, gender, and ethnic systems as vital resources for global survival. Thank you.